Can a relationship really exist without love? Like, really?
Yeah.
It kind of feels like we're going against, everything we've been told about relationships.
Yeah, for sure.
This article we're looking at today, is there a relationship without love? The debate nobody wants to have really throws down a challenge.
Yeah.
Makes us rethink, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew about love and partnerships.
Absolutely. It kind of throws those fairy tale notions right out the window,
Yeah.
the ones we're bombarded with from childhood.
Right.
And it forces us to look at all the different ways people connect, all those relationships that exist outside that romantic love conquers all story.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, right? We've got this article, a bunch of research, and even some personal stories that show just how different relationships can be, how people experience connection in all sorts of ways.
It's amazing how much variety is out there when you really start looking.
So listeners, get ready. This is going to get interesting.
I'm ready when you are. Where should we start?
Okay, so the article dives right in. This idea of love as a social construct, like how much of what we believe about love is actually, well, it's just stuff we've been taught, from movies, marketing, all that.
It's such a key point. I mean, we're surrounded by images of romantic love, right?
Oh, yeah.
Movies, music, Valentine's Day. It's a billion-dollar industry. It's easy to forget that those picture-perfect romances don't always match up with real life.
Yeah, and the article's saying that all that romantic imagery can actually mess with our view of what's normal in a relationship.
Exactly. It sets these crazy high expectations, and it puts pressure on people, to find the one. Like, that's the only way to be happy, even if there are other types of relationships that could be just as fulfilling.
So are we saying love is like a made-up thing?
Well, not exactly, but we have to acknowledge how our culture, how society shapes our understanding of love and relationships. Take arranged marriages, for example.
Right. The article talked about those. It's a great example of a relationship that doesn't always start with romantic love. But here's the crazy thing. They often have lower divorce rates than love marriages. How does that even work?
Well, there are theories, One is that arranged marriages prioritize different things: compatibility, shared values, family support. It's less about that initial spark of passion. And those things, they can create a solid base for the relationship to grow on.
So instead of jumping in head first because of those intense feelings, couples in arranged marriages have time, right? Time to develop love and intimacy as they build a life together.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And it really challenges that whole idea that romantic love has to be the main reason for being in a relationship.
Makes you think, what's more important? That initial burst of passion or that slow burn of connection that builds over time?
It's a good question. No easy answer, though. But it definitely shows us that there are different paths to a good relationship, one that works.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about arranged marriages. What about those relationships where, money is a big factor, like sugar dating? The article goes there.
Yeah, it's a touchy subject, often gets labeled as superficial or exploitative. But the article makes an interesting point. In a lot of relationships, financial stability and resources, they're already playing a role, right? Even if people don't talk about it openly.
So maybe transactional relationships are just being more upfront about what's already happening in many partnerships.
Right. It's a different perspective. In a world where money problems are a huge reason why couples fight, maybe being honest about those financial dynamics from the get-go isn't such a bad thing.
It makes you wonder, right? Sometimes that fairy tale idea of pure romantic love, maybe that can actually cause more harm than a relationship where everyone's clear about what they expect, even if it involves money.
It challenges us to think about what a real or valid relationship really is. What does that even mean?
Okay, so we've talked about arranged marriages and transactional relationships, but there's another side to this whole no love required idea, a darker side, codependent relationships, and those get messy.
For sure. Codependency, it's often a sign that something's not right in a relationship. Couples stay together out of need, maybe fear, a sense of obligation. Not really because they love each other. These relationships, they can last forever, but they're usually missing that genuine emotional connection. And that can be pretty damaging for both people.
It's like even without love, those relationships can still provide something, right? Financial security, stability, maybe just the fear of being alone.
You got it. That's what makes codependency so tricky. It shows us that relationships can fulfill all sorts of needs, even without romantic love. But then there's the ethical question. Are these relationships actually good for people in the long run?
It adds another layer to this whole discussion, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If a relationship meets certain needs, even without love, is it still a valid relationship? Is it ethical?
Tough questions, and I don't think there's a simple answer. But they're questions we got to ask ourselves as we explore, the whole spectrum of human relationships.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered arranged marriages, those transactional relationships, and codependency. The article also talks about a very modern phenomenon, situationships.
Yeah.
This one feels super relevant, especially with how a lot of people are dating nowadays.
Situationships, right. They're those undefined, kind of fuzzy relationships. Not really just hooking up, but not a serious relationship either. They're somewhere in between.
And the article suggests that these situationships, they might be connected to a few things. Dating apps, how our ideas about commitment are changing, maybe even this growing desire for freedom and flexibility in relationships.
Exactly. Dating apps have made it so easy to connect with people, but it's also created this overload of options, makes it harder for some people to settle down. And our views on commitment have definitely shifted. Marriage and those traditional milestones, they don't hold the same weight anymore. It's more about individual happiness now.
So situationships are kind of reflecting those bigger cultural changes, huh? It's like people are testing things out, seeing what works before they go all in on a relationship.
You got it. And it brings us back to that core question: can a relationship exist without love? Situationships, they kind of suggest that maybe, just maybe, we're redefining what a relationship even means.
And that leads us perfectly into the next part of our discussion. We've looked at all these different types of relationships, but now it's time to zoom out a bit. Think bigger picture. I want to dive into the philosophical and scientific perspectives on love and connection.
Sounds good to me. Let's see what philosophers and scientists have to say about all this, about love and its role in how we connect. Welcome back. Glad to be diving deeper into these different ways people approach relationships. Really fascinating stuff.
Me too. It's making me think about things in a whole new way. Like some of the ideas I had about relationships, well, maybe they weren't so accurate after all. So before we move on to the philosophy and science stuff, I'd love to hear from you, the listener. What are your thoughts so far? Anything standing out to you? Maybe a type of relationship that really resonates with you? Or one that you're just like, wait, what? Something you're still trying to wrap your head around. We want to hear from you.
Absolutely. Your perspectives are what make this whole conversation so insightful. After all, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to relationships. What works for one person might be totally different for someone else, and that's okay.
Exactly. The key is to be honest with ourselves about what we actually want and need from our connections, and to respect other people's choices, even if they're not the choices we would make. Now, speaking of choices, this article brings up something interesting. This idea that our culture's obsession with romantic love, maybe it has a downside.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly told we need to find the one, that's the only way to be truly happy and have a good life.
Totally.
Yeah.
And if we don't have that epic love story, it's like we're failing somehow.
Exactly. It creates so much pressure, right? To put romantic love above everything else, even if it means sacrificing other parts of our lives, friendships or careers, things we're passionate about.
And here's the thing. All that pressure to find true love, it might actually make us less likely to appreciate other kinds of connections that could be just as fulfilling.
You're right. We tend to forget about those deep friendships that give us support, laughter, and shared experiences, or the strong family bonds that give us a sense of belonging and unconditional love. Those connections get pushed aside when we're so focused on romantic love.
It's like we're missing out on all these other forms of love that are right there in front of us. And sometimes, all that focus on romantic love can even lead us into relationships that aren't actually good for us, just because they fit that mold of what we think a relationship should be.
It's about breaking free from those expectations, those societal norms. That idea that romantic love is the be-all and end-all, it's not.
So how do we do that? How do we start valuing all the different kinds of connections in our lives? Not just the romantic ones.
I think it starts with awareness. Recognizing that all those messages we get about finding the one, they're often driven by, things like marketing or what society expects, not necessarily by what's truly going to make us happy as individuals.
And maybe it's also about being more intentional, right? About putting effort into those non-romantic relationships, spending time with our friends, connecting with family, joining groups or activities that we enjoy, things like that.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that love and connection, they come in so many different forms, and that a good life, a happy life, often includes a whole mix of relationships.
Like building a diverse portfolio of connections, each one serving a different purpose and bringing something unique to our lives.
Exactly. Some will be for emotional support, others for intellectual stimulation, some just for companionship and shared experiences.
Yeah.
Mixing it up.
Spreading the love, so to speak. And this idea of diversifying our connections, It seems especially relevant now when we think about those situationships we talked about earlier. It's almost like people are instinctively searching for different types of connection, even if they're not fully aware of it.
That's a good point. Maybe situationships are a way for people to try out different levels of intimacy and commitment without feeling like they have to follow those traditional relationship rules.
Like dipping their toes in the water, testing the temperature before they jump in the deep end.
And in some ways, that experimentation can be a good thing. It gives people the space to figure out what they need and what they want without feeling pressured to follow a certain path.
But then there's that question. Can situationships really be fulfilling in the long run? Can you truly have that deep connection and intimacy without a certain level of commitment?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. For some people, situationships might be exactly what they're looking for, but for others, it might leave them feeling empty or even used. It really depends.
It all comes back to that idea of personal choice. Being honest with ourselves about what we want from a relationship, whatever we choose to call it. But let's face it, navigating relationships these days, it can be tough, especially with all the societal pressures and constantly changing norms.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why it's helpful to step back sometimes, Look at the bigger picture. Think about how other people have viewed love and connection, how philosophers and scientists have approached these ideas throughout history. It can give us some new insights.
Okay, so let's dive into the philosophy pool. This article mentions a few key thinkers, like Plato and Sartre. They had very different views on love.
Plato, he believed that love was all about searching for beauty and truth, a way to connect with something bigger than ourselves. He saw romantic love as a step towards a higher kind of love, a love of knowledge and wisdom.
So for Plato, love wasn't necessarily about finding the one, but about using relationships to grow as a person and understand the world better.
Exactly. Now, Sartre, he had a completely different take, a much more cynical view. He saw love as a form of self-deception. Like we trick ourselves into believing that another person can complete us or give our lives meaning.
So Sartre thought that relying on someone else for happiness would only lead to disappointment. Kind of like that saying, you can't love someone else until you love yourself.
Yeah, that's the idea. And while Sartre's view might seem a bit harsh, I think it reminds us how important self-awareness and personal responsibility are in relationships. We can't put all that pressure on another person to fill the gaps in our own lives. True happiness comes from within.
Okay, so we've got Plato's idealistic view of love as a path to wisdom, and Sartre's more pessimistic take on love as a form of self-deception. It's quite a range. But what about the science of love? The article mentioned something about attachment styles, didn't it?
Oh yeah, attachment theory is a really interesting field. It looks at the different ways people connect with others based on their childhood experiences.
And there are different attachment styles, right? Like secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment. What do those actually mean, and how do they affect our relationships?
Basically, they describe our patterns of relating to other people, especially in close relationships. Secure attachment, it's all about feeling safe and comfortable in relationships. People with a secure attachment style can usually form healthy, balanced connections.
So they feel confident in their relationships without constantly worrying about being abandoned or rejected.
Exactly. And then you have people with an anxious attachment style. They tend to be more preoccupied with their relationships. They want to be close and get reassurance, but they're also worried about their partner being there for them and responding to their needs.
So it's like they're always on edge, looking for signs that their partner might be pulling away or losing interest. That sounds exhausting.
It can be. Anxious attachment often comes from a fear of being abandoned, which can go back to childhood experiences where caregivers weren't always there for them emotionally.
And then there's avoidant attachment, right? What's that like in a relationship?
People with an avoidant attachment style, they value their independence and self-reliance. They like their space and can get uncomfortable with too much closeness or intimacy.
So they're the ones who seem emotionally distant, who avoid commitment and have trouble expressing their feelings.
That's the stereotype. But it's important to remember that avoidance is often a way of protecting themselves. A defense mechanism. People with an avoidant attachment style, they might have experienced rejection or emotional neglect when they were younger, which made them think it's safer to keep their distance.
It's amazing how those early experiences can shape our relationships later in life. But the good news is that we're not stuck with those patterns forever, right? With therapy and self-awareness, people can develop more secure attachment styles and have healthier relationships.
Absolutely. Attachment styles can change. It takes effort and support, but we can learn to overcome our anxieties and build stronger connections.
It's like we can rewrite our own relationship stories, even if the first few chapters were a bit rough.
Exactly. And speaking of stories, the article goes into some really interesting personal experiences that show how differently people approach relationships in real life.
Yeah, those were fascinating. It's like seeing these abstract concepts play out in real people's lives. It
Yeah.
really drives home the point that there's no one right way to have a successful relationship.
Right. Each relationship is unique. It's shaped by individual personalities, cultural backgrounds, life experiences, all of that.
So let's talk about a few of those stories.
Yeah.
What about Maria and Ahmed? They've been happily married for 20 years, and they started with an arranged marriage.
Their story really challenges our Western ideas about what makes a good partnership. They didn't have that initial rush of romantic love, but they built their relationship on shared values, mutual respect, and a deep commitment to family.
And then there's Jessica and Mark. They're in a relationship that they openly call transactional marks. Mark provides financial security, and Jessica offers companionship and support. It's not your typical romantic relationship, but they both seem happy with it.
Their story shows how important honesty and transparency are. They're not pretending to be something they're not. They have clear expectations and boundaries, and they both seem satisfied with the arrangement.
And last but not least, Leela and Sam. They stayed in a codependent marriage for 15 years, mainly for their kids. Their story is a bit more complicated because codependency often involves some unhealthy dynamics.
That's true. But even within their challenges, Leela and Sam found a way to make their relationship work for a while. It wasn't about love in the romantic sense, but about providing stability and a sense of family for their children. It makes you think about sacrifice and compromise in relationships and the tough decisions we sometimes have to make.
These personal stories are such a powerful reminder that relationships come in all shapes and sizes, and what might seem unusual or even unacceptable to one person can be perfectly fulfilling for someone else.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love for you, the listener, to think about what these stories mean to you. What parts resonate with your own experiences? And what challenges your beliefs about relationships?
Because at the end of the day, the power to define what love and connection mean to you, that's in your hands. It's a personal choice.
Okay, so we're back. Last part of our deep dive into this whole can a relationship exist without love thing.
It's been a journey, hasn't it?
We've talked about what societal norms, all those different relationship models, even gone into philosophy and attachment theory.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
And, through all of that, one thing keeps popping up, this idea of choice, personal choice.
Definitely. It's not about saying love is the answer or it's not the answer.
Well,
It's more like recognizing that each person, they get to decide what a fulfilling relationship means to them, with or without romantic love being part of the equation.
that just feels so freeing, Like it takes the pressure off. We don't have to force our relationships into some mold. Right, exactly. And the article, it actually had this quote that really resonated with me. It said, "It doesn't matter if it's built on love, respect, necessity, even convenience, a relationship's value, it all comes down to the people in it."
I love that. It's
Yeah.
so validating. It's like, hey, there are so many ways to connect, and no one way is the right way, as long as it works for the people involved.
Exactly. And something else to think about. Our needs and desires in relationships, they can change over time. What makes us happy at one point in our lives might be totally different later on.
Which is why it's so important to be self-aware, to communicate openly. We have to know what we really want and be able to talk about it with our partners.
It's about having the guts to define our own terms, instead of letting society tell us what should make us happy.
So if you're listening and feeling kind of overwhelmed by all this relationship talk, or maybe you're questioning your own relationships, just take a breath. There's no right or wrong answer.
The biggest question is, are you getting what you need from your connections? Do you feel respected, supported, fulfilled?
If you can say yes, then awesome. You're doing great. Doesn't matter what label you put on it.
And if the answer is no, well, that's important information too. It might be a sign to rethink things, have some honest conversations, or even explore different types of relationships.
At the end of the day, it's about finding those connections that bring joy, meaning a sense of belonging.
And that can look so many different ways. A passionate love story that lasts a lifetime, a close group of friends, even an arrangement that meets specific needs. There are so many possibilities.
The main thing is this: we get to choose what works for us. Love can be amazing, a powerful part of many relationships, but it's not the only way.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last thought. Instead of getting hung up on whether love is or isn't necessary for a relationship, what if we shifted our thinking a bit?
What do you mean?
What if instead of asking, can a relationship exist without love? We asked, what makes a connection truly fulfilling no matter what we call it?
Wow, that changes everything. It really opens up a new way of looking at relationships.
I think so too. So as you move through your own relationships, romantic or not, remember that question. You might be surprised by what you discover.
And on that note, dear listener, we'll leave you to explore all the wonderful possibilities of human connection. Until next time, keep diving deep.